Hmm. Is
Uh,
Clara live?
let's start.
We live?
Yeah, we are live.
Great. All right. Um, Good evening, everyone. I'm Sheetal, and I'm a research scholar at Red Lantern Analytica. Today, I have with me Aditya, Mandeep, and Ojasvi as panelists for today's discussion on US-China relations with respect to COVID-19 crisis. The order on Tuesday to close the Chinese consulate in Houston with only 72 hours' notice was only the latest action by the administration that has infuriated officials in China. In a matter of weeks, Beijing has endured a stepped up campaign against its 5G wireless technology, sanctions against officials overseeing Hong Kong, and the largely Muslim region of Xinjiang. And now there are accusations that China has dispatched scores of soldiers undercover to steal commercial, military, and even medical secrets. A spokesman for China's foreign ministry vowed again on Thursday that the government would retaliate in kind to the closure. He dismissed the administration's accusations as a malicious smearing. Behind the scenes, senior Chinese officials seem to have very little desire to escalate the tensions even further, concerned that any move could play into President Trump's hands as he mounts his re-election campaign. A highly visible showdown with China could distract Americans from Mr. Trump's botched response to the pandemic and allow him to campaign as a leader who is defending his country against a foreign power. If China wanted to hunt Mr. Trump in the elections, Beijing could halt the large purchases of American food that is agreed to make as part of the trade truce negotiated between the pandemic broke out. That would penalize American farmers who could prove an important voting bloc in some states. In September 2008, China surpassed Japan to become the largest holder of US debt at about $600 billion dollars. The growing interdependencies between the US and the Chinese economies has taken China on a track to overtake the United States as the world's number one economy by 2027. According to Goldman Sachs chief economist Jim O'Neill, at the start of 2011, China reported a total GDP of $5.88 trillion in 2010 compared to Japan's $5.47 trillion. With that being said, I'd like either one of you to give a little context to our topic of discussion, perhaps a brief discussion on the historical relations that US and China have shared with each other.
Uh, I would like to answer that, Sheetal. I guess it is important to understand whether, while we are looking at certain important historical events that forged the initial relation of US and China, that throughout the years, this relationship has been of a trust deficit. Now, all the events we are touching upon may not directly be China versus US all out fight, but due to lack of information and various other factors, we need to realize that the relationship doesn't have a lot of trust and a lot of, say, respect for each other's policies. When People's Republic of China came into being in the domain of international relations in 1949, when Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, actually defeated the nationalist forces by leading a peace-backed revolution. US didn't support that government initially. US supported the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who Mao was fighting against. So for a large period of time, US supported that government, which actually fled and was hiding in Taiwan, because the troops of Chiang Kai-shek actually fought against Japan, side to side US. So the US was supporting that. Similarly, in 1950, another significant thing happened when Soviet-backed, a communist-backed Soviet Union, along with North Korea, had an all-out attack against South Korea. Then US forces and UN forces came into the defense of South Korea. But when the forces reached the border of China, China being communist China obviously supported Soviet Union and North Korea. So these two were significant bone of contention in the first 2 years when China started its life as a nation state. But there are two or three more events which will I just comment briefly upon. The major game-changing event one can say, and many scholars say, is that President Nixon's move in 1972, when the first step US took for the normalization of relationship. They signed important several important several important like Taiwan and other issues. And the important thing is that he was the first president to actually spend 8 days in China and actually tried to understand. So that was one radical move. And in October 2000, we all know that US and China eventually signed the trade deal. And in 2001, China formally entered World Trade Organization. And now China is the leading partner of US in terms of trade. So I guess these are the important events, but obviously it's in 2 or 3 minutes you cannot cover the trajectory of two countries. But again, two important points: trust deficit, and all these events that I narrated, they are not always directly linked to each other. Meaning China is not always doing everything just to piss off US. For example, Tiananmen Square happened and it was against the values of democracy according to the US, but it was not directly an attack against US. So if we keep these two differences in mind, I guess we should be good. Thank you.
Right. There's an article by Xi Jinping that's been published this week in the Quishi Journal. Many people have been talking about the title, the timing, all of that. What's your take on that?
So I can answer that question. So basically, Xi Jinping has told he wants to consolidate his power as a leader, which he has done after Hu Jintao's rule. When he came into power in 2013, he wanted to consolidate as much as power as much as possible. So he took control of the Communist Party. He's still known as the General Secretary, as Mike Pompeo once said 2 years ago. Like, he's not the president; he's still the General Secretary, and he has taken over the defense analysts also. So these 18 points, they are basically just 18 points which have been told here and there by Xi Jinping, tells that leadership is the most important and you have to look after the Communist Party, and Communist Party's heart and soul rests on the leader. So he basically wants to say that if you want to succeed in future and if you want to see a brighter future for China, I think you should rely on me. So that's what it basically tells.
Very well, Aditya. Obama has been in China hasn't been to China prior to his presidency. His visit to China in
Yeah,
2009
it was
was
the
his
first time in
first.
2009.
I'm sorry, are you saying something?
Yeah, yeah. He visited China for the first time in 2009 once he got elected. He hadn't visited it prior to the time.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm just getting to that. So as Ojasvi mentioned that 2009 was the first time that he mentioned that he visited China, in contrast to many of his recent predecessors who had visited China before becoming president. On this, one former US official familiar with China ridiculed Obama, and I quote, "It's a pity that Obama did not visit China until now, going there in his capacity as US president." He repeatedly expressed that the United States welcomes the rise of China, and he characterizes US and China relationship as the most important bilateral relationship of our time. What do you think about this with respect to Obama's administration? Well, just this
So
question is
after, acha, yeah, yeah, go for it.
Sorry?
this question is to you, Jaspreet.
Right, right. What do I think about the administration? So
Obama's administration, yes.
see, the bilateral relations during the time of Obama weren't as strained as they are currently. So when you look at the nature of leadership, I feel that that strongly determines your relations with the country. And you have a leader like Obama who is able to maintain fairly sound bilateral relations without any major contestations, like we see presently with Trump. So latest being Houston, but otherwise there's so many tensions we see with the COVID virus. We see with the trade war, which is gradually escalating into a war, which is globally dragging all nations. And we see it with other cases like how the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs, are being treated, or how the Hong Kong or South China Sea crisis is. So we see that, like, though there were areas of contestation, like we do see trade relations strained during the time of Obama as well. We don't see them as severe as they are in present status quo. So I think nature of how the leader is and how he is handling the relations strongly determine the relations between two nations. So yeah, in the future, I think if Trump is going to get elected again, then we are going to see the relations getting worse and more strained over time.
Right. United States demand this week that China close its consulate in Houston in the latest in a string of disputes that have taken relationship between the world's two biggest economies to its lowest point in decades. Would you like to elucidate on the current tensions that's been going on between the two?
Mandeep, if you want, you can answer.
Either of you.
Yeah, so the in Houston's consulate is known as the first consulate set up by China after 1972, after the Nixon move. It was set up in 1979. So when it was shut down, it sent basically tremor waves down both the nations, that the relationships have basically broken down completely. So when Houston consulate was set up, they alleged that it is being dealing with espionage and trade activities and trade secrets, plus scientific secrets are being basically shipped to China, whatever is happening in US. So see, the Trump administration is basically setting up a war against China because it knows that it has failed on the face of pandemic, and it doesn't want to lose on the basis of that in the general election which is coming up. And it knows that it has to portray or paint a villain, just like India did in back in elections in 2018 and 2014 also. Our main agenda is Pakistan, and there the main agenda is whatever power which is rising up, and the power which is rising up right now is China. So Trump administration has done that, and you can see that China has retaliated. Like, it has closed its consulate in Chengdu, and we can see that this relationship, which has basically felt a tremor back in 2012 also. See, in 1999 when the bombings happened in Serbia, now Serbia, like that day it was Yugoslavia. That day also the tremors were felt, that if China retaliates, because China was not a big power back then, and now we can see that it is a big power, and you can't question the legitimacy of China in the global, what you can say, global diplomacy at all, because China's, what you can say, views or strengths lie in every corridor now, whereas US is struggling under economic impotence and of course the pandemic also. So the retaliation which has been given by the Trump administration is actually quite heavy handed according to me, and it's basically what you can expect of a Trump administration at all.
Right. Very well, Aditya.
Sheetal, before going into details about the areas of contestation and tension, I would like to comment something with regard to the trust deficit which Mandeep brought about earlier in the discussion.
I'm sorry. Could you come again?
Before I go into detail with regard to the areas of contestation between the US and China, I would like to comment a little bit with regard to the trust deficit. So, can I go ahead with that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Um, so scholars in both countries have pointed out that US and China are suffering from a trust deficit, which Mandeep had brought forth earlier. And as trust is something which cannot be built through words alone. So both countries should do a better job at demonstrating their mutual understanding and respect for each other. Over the past 8 years, this relationship has become complicated, and bilateral issues have hindered because of the false perception that the development of like China is trying to take control over the United States to establish itself as a global superpower. In fact, it's this overreaction to every situation that has pushed United States into a defensive position. That's something which is undeniable, right? So we see American interest groups, the US Department of Defense, and the US military. They've subsequently adopted tough stances on cybersecurity, China's establishment of the East China Sea, air defense identification zone, and its land reclamation efforts in the South China Sea. Now, these positions should not be seen as provocations directly aimed at China, but rather as the result of America's own strategic calculations in reaction to China's initiatives. So it's China which is initiating these measures, as we noticed, and it's America which is taking a defensive stance to retaliate. Um, the United States is a global power with unique norms, perspectives, and strategies. China should not interpret every US action as an effort of containment, in my opinion. But for the same measure, it is misguided for the United States to consider every Chinese action as a challenge to its preeminent position. So the two sides should avoid making assumptions and policies based on extreme views and misguided conspiracy theories, which seems to be the case right now, especially with regard to the conspiracies which have been put forth during the times of the COVID vaccine, the COVID virus. So I think both sides need to initiate measures and not take such drastic steps or formulate conspiracy theories, and should rather um, take mutual respect and mutual understanding towards each other in the future for sound relations.
Right. So since you mentioned that, Washington has been for a very long time, has been concerned about China's no strings attached infrastructure in the African markets. What do you think about China's attraction towards Africa? Either of you could take that as well, or just we could take it as well. Up to you.
Mandeep?
I guess it's an important area which we need to discuss that, Sheetal.
I think there's.
Okay. Apologies. I guess there's poor connectivity today. Bad luck. But coming back to my point, I guess before we come to Africa, one more point I would like to mention is that all of these fights are happening at different fronts, and we need to acknowledge that. For example, a trade war is not same as in going out for an all war, and say 5G or in battling in space technology is not same. So when we are talking about US-China relations, we need to understand that it is not all aggressive all the time, and we don't need to categorize it in certain boxes that this is happening. Instead, if we're talking about trade, let's contextualize it in terms of the world trade and then the US China battle, instead of just seeing it as another war. And now coming to Africa, that is important because US wasn't paying much attention to Africa before China actually stepped in. So that's point number one, because China has done a lot of investment through BRI and various other initiatives. Most of them have been a lot of funding, a lot of financial and infrastructure help, as you said, with no strings attached. But that doesn't mean that it's just limited to finances and infrastructure. Now, what is happening is that they have started influencing the governments as well. More than government, there's a model that works in China that is controlling the information, controlling the media, which has slowly crept its way into Africa as well through various startups and initiatives like Huawei and
Right.
ZTE. Now, these companies have presence in more than 30 African countries as of now. They have their own
Right.
separate channels where they can bombard a lot of information in seconds. So I guess US is more worried about the information problem as of now. Obviously, infrastructure and finances are one of the biggest concerns. But the new game is the information game. And in the Trump administration, that is the game in terms of the last elections, the Russian intervention, and all of these factors. So if I would be USA, I would be cautious about that.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. What do you think about the future prospects that could land up between these two countries?
So under the Trump administration, basically, United States has eroded whatever image it had, what you can say, cultivated over a lot of years on the multilateral stage. So when Trump administration came into power, it went into protectionist mode completely. It wanted to serve its own country first and then look after the other countries. So what has happened? What has happened is that it has backed out of major what you can say multilateral organizations like the currently WHO. It has backed out completely.
WHO will withdraw by 2025.
Yeah. So what has happened is that when it is basically criticizing and aggressively pushing for international diaspora to completely back off China, it is actually banking on the international image it has cultivated over these 3 years, and it is not faring well. So when Joe Biden comes into power, in the next election, in the latest election which is going to come up. He's basically going to focus on the point that we have to go back into the multilateral organization, because it is the only way to actually what you can say combat China on all fronts, because China is actually actively pursuing its image in the multilateral organization. It's quite evident in WHO also. It's as the coronavirus pandemic, what you can say fund which was set up by the WHO, the highest contributor to that has been China. So you can see that the future prospects are quite bleak. Both of the countries are ruled under authoritarian governments right now, because Trump administration doesn't want the information to be let out. It has been doing, like the prime example for that is the DRDC, the way he is handling the DRDC organization also there. So you can see that both the countries are held up by authoritarian governments, and both of them can push the buttons to actually accelerate the situation completely.
Right.
So the future for this actually looks bleak, but let's see what happens.
You're right, absolutely, absolutely relevant. We also have a few questions over here. I'm going to be taking these questions up. The first one is by Mano Ranjan, sir. What will be the future of South China Sea, especially after Secretary Pompo's comment? Will this become the battleground, or it's mostly about economic war?
No, it can become the
I would
battleground.
like to answer that.
Go, go, go. Sorry.
Uh, Sorry. Thank you. But before I answer the question, I would like to also add something for the future prospect, since the elections are coming in the US in November.
All right, yeah.
Uh, there are two things which I would like to say. It becomes difficult for Trump administration right now to say against China. What I mean is, when I'm objectively seeing US-China relations right now, as Aditya said, they are very bleak. But what I see, what is happening in the domestic sphere of the US, then sort of Trump administration loses quite credibility when it points out the various violation of fundamental rights that are happening in China. For example, as Ojasvi pointed out, if we are talking about Uyghur Muslims and their treatment, then we have Portland and Black Lives protest happening in the US, and perhaps violation of certain rights. So, with Trump administration, obviously there are a lot of more words than actions. That is what I have observed. But I will come back to this point. But if administration even comes, what is important to understand is that there is a silver lining in all of this chaos, because China is right now a bit isolated in Asia diplomatically. It has been using unconstrained power, and it has been more aggressive. It has been more repressive at home, more aggressive internationally. The recent India China standoff, and as one of our viewers have mentioned, the South China Sea dispute, it has escalated. So I doubt that, though China is a legitimate state, as Aditya mentioned, and it is one of the growing powers, or it has probably arrived. But one needs to realize, how is it arriving? President Xi Jinping's uh, the essay which you mentioned, it talks about road to rejuvenation. It talks about becoming the strongest economy by 2049, and that's perfectly fine for a nation state to aspire for that, to achieve that. But the question is how. So I guess our duty is to keep a very close tap on how. And now coming back to South China Sea, I guess as we discussed last week, it is about the economical war, but it doesn't seem so now, at least anymore, because it has become significantly militarized, and it is a sort of arms race. A lot of scholars are saying that. So an all out confrontation, as I said that time, the chances are less. It may not happen, but it's just not about the economy alone in South China
It's
Sea
about
now.
exerting
Obviously,
dominating
the
power also,
intention
right?
might be exactly. It is about economic resources. It is about minerals. It is about asserting power. It's about security. So it's about sovereignty and claim over sovereignty. So it's a lot of these issues. We have got one more comment.
Yes.
Do
Before
you think
go
that
on to the
China?
next comment, Mandeep, I would like Ojasvi if she wants to add anything to this question.
Not with regard to this question per se, but with regard to the future, we've also seen how, with China and the United States, journalism is something the journalists and students are suffering greatly. So we see a lot of curtailment of freedom of expression. We see a lot of journalists' houses being shut down in the United States, and we see the same in China happening as well. And we've already heard derogatory remarks being made by President Trump with regard to Chinese journalists. So we see how an, a contestation between the two nations is dragging parties like students and journalists into it, and how they feel that their career and future is being threatened, and how if we see Trump coming to power, then there's going to be further curtailment of their freedom of speech, and we're also going to see more. With, with regard to China, we're going to see a further contestation between the US and China with regard to abuse of human rights. So we've seen the case with the Uyghur Muslims, and every day we read about clashes between the US and China in this regard. The US coming and criticizing China for these moves, and China coming and holding its stance by saying that the US has engaged in extreme power moves like this and xenophobia in the past. So we do see that there's completely inhuman how third parties are being dragged into the equation. So it's not just with regard to the economy or the trade or how the COVID virus is being handled, but how mining disputes like these are also being dragged into the conversation. But with regard to what Mandeep said, South China Sea, we do see that though it may seem like an economical perspective or an economical reason, there are several underlying reasons, and perhaps the most prominent of these would be to exert power and show prominence.
All
And
right.
coming back to the comment, do you think China can overtake in major international organizations? It is a very interesting question, but I think more than overtaking, our concern is that China is setting up its own organizations and allies by hook and crook against the conventional organizations. A very good example can be that recently US exited from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a major economic bloc for US in favor against China. But on the other hand, China still has BRI, China still has Shanghai Corporation, where it's actually planning to include more members. So I guess the alternative strategy for China is to set up its own international organizations where it can play the leading role. And yeah, that should be it.
Adding to that, Mandeep, I also feel like a lot of international organizations, at least presently because of their management of the COVID or otherwise, for instance, the WHO or the UN, a lot of people are losing faith in these organizations. Like we see the US stepping down from the WHO and criticizing the UN. So we see a lot of organizations are not able to render that peacemaking, that role which they have over the years. So do you think that in the future these organizations are going to come back and exert their dominance, or you think that other organizations are going to take their place? You've spoken about how China may be leading these organizations, but like how do you think that change is supposed to come about?
I don't think so. It will happen because of the obvious fact that there are already several countries that are contemplating their relationships and the deals they have signed with China. China, again, I don't believe that all of the world is straight out. International relations is about anarchy and a certain power. So I guess a lot of countries are already reevaluating their relations with China and how they have to move forward. Because obviously, an aggressive country with a lot of financial and military power can give you security, can give you resources, but one day it will dictate the terms also or ask for something in return, quid pro quo. So I guess the chances, I don't think so that will happen. I don't think so because at the end of the day it's also about human rights, mutual respect, and each country mending its own business.
Is that all?
Yes, I guess we are good. If we don't have any
All
more
right.
questions, we can
All right.
conclude this.
All right. So thank you so much, Mandeep, Aditya, and Ojasvi for joining me today on this discussion. I think it was very insightful. Thank you so much. Um, I think that's all. We don't have any more questions either. So I think we could proceed and sign off from today's talk.